Now give me the knife! Not this!
Hey guys, welcome back to yet another marvelous video. Alfred Hitchcock is called the master of suspense, the man who made people afraid to take a shower after Psycho and think twice before looking out the window after Rear Window. But behind the fame and classic movies was a man full of surprises. He had strange habits, unusual fears, and a personality that was just as mysterious as his films. Some of these facts are funny, some are a bit creepy, and others will make you see him in a totally new light. So let's look into 15 shocking facts about Alfred Hitchcock that you probably did not know. Sit back and enjoy as we dive in. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Did Hitchcock once ask to be locked up as a child? One of the strangest and most telling stories from Alfred Hitchcock's childhood is about the time he was locked up in a police cell on purpose. Hitchcock was the youngest of 3 children, but he often described his childhood as lonely. His father was strict, and his mother was extremely protective, which made home life a strange mix of fear and comfort. When Alfred was about 5, his father used to send him to the local police station with a note saying that he had misbehaved. The police officer would read the note and then lock the little boy in a cell for a few minutes before letting him go out. It was meant to teach him a lesson, but it did more than that. The experience terrified him. In interviews, he said he was terrified even of being stopped by a police officer, even when he hadn't done anything wrong. It made him deeply afraid of small, enclosed spaces and gave him a lifelong fear of being wrongly accused or punished. Those fears later became part of his filmmaking style. Many of his movies show characters trapped or blamed for crimes they did not commit, just like his own childhood experience. Outside of his father's discipline, Hitchcock's mother doted on him and often comforted him with food, which he later joked about, saying it was why he grew up with a love for eating and his famous round shape. Was Hitchcock terrified of eggs? A classic quiche Lorraine usually needs a few eggs, something that Alfred Hitchcock was not a big fan of. In fact, eggs were one of the few things that truly scared him. It's strange then that one of his favorite breakfasts was quiche Lorraine. Despite his dislike, Hitchcock loved this dish enough to face his fear. Hitchcock even had his own special way of making it. His recipe included beating 4 eggs with salt, cayenne pepper, and nutmeg before mixing them into the quiche. That says a lot about how much he loved it. The man who could not stand the sight of a cracked egg was willing to whisk them himself just to enjoy his favorite meal. So what exactly made him hate eggs so much? Hitchcock once explained that he found them deeply unsettling, especially the way they look when broken open. He thought the yellow yolk spilling out was far more disgusting than anything you would see in one of his films. While audiences were terrified by the famous shower scene in Psycho, Hitchcock himself was horrified by the slow trickle of egg yolk from a cracked shell. Eggs were not the only thing that made him nervous, though. He also admitted that watching a souffle bake filled him with anxiety. He couldn't stand waiting to see if it would rise or collapse. To ease his nerves, he bought an oven with a glass door just to watch, and that didn't help much either. Still, his love for quiche Lorraine won out in the end. He enjoyed it so much that it even appeared in his 1955 film To Catch a Thief. Did Hitchcock design silent film title cards before directing? Before Alfred Hitchcock ever directed, he designed title cards, also called intertitles, for silent films. These were the printed cards that appeared between scenes, giving dialogue or narration, since there was no spoken sound in movies yet. When Famous Players Lasky, an American company, opened a British branch in London around 1920, Hitchcock, who was working in advertising at Henley's, heard about it. He made design sketches for title cards and showed them to the studio. They liked what he had done. Hitchcock was hired to do title card designs. His job involved deciding how they looked, how the text appeared, and sometimes even helping with what they said. It may not sound glamorous, but it taught him a lot about how to tell a story visually, something that would later become his trademark. He worked on several films as a title designer between 1920 and 1922, including The Call of Youth from 1921 and The Spanish Jade from 1922. Working on title cards might seem seem like it's just a small job, but for Hitchcock, it was a huge learning experience. Because of this work, he developed a strong sense of how images, text, and design could work together to tell part of a story without words. It also taught him about pacing, when to reveal information, and how to guide the viewer's attention, lessons that would later shape his suspenseful directing style. During his early years working in the title card department, Hitchcock got the chance to work closely with the writers and really study their scripts. This experience helped him understand how stories were structured and how scripts were put together. It also gave him a first taste of filmmaking. Whenever a small extra scene was needed for a movie, he would be sent out to film it himself. These small tasks gave Hitchcock practical experience behind the camera and helped him learn the basics of directing long before he made his first feature film. Are many of Hitchcock's silent films completely lost? Most of the feature-length films made during Hollywood's silent era are gone forever. Out of roughly 11,000 movies produced between 1912 and 1930, only about 14% survive in their original form. Another 11% are available in foreign language versions or in lower quality copies, but the remaining 70% are completely lost. Early studios often failed to preserve these films, which officials have described as a serious and irreversible loss to America's cultural history. Silent movies have a unique impact. Without spoken dialogue, filmmakers had to rely entirely on visuals to tell a story. That limitation created a style of storytelling that still resonates today. Many of these lost films were destroyed by fire, damaged by decay, or simply neglected. Studios often didn't see the value in keeping old prints. Of the major studios, MGM managed to preserve a fair number, while Paramount is known to have neglected much of its early catalog. During the period when Hitchcock was starting out, film preservation was not a priority. Several of his earliest projects did not survive, and what could have been his first feature as a director never made it past production. Luckily, some of Hitchcock's silent-era work can still be seen today, though only 9 of his early films survive. One of the most famous is The White Shadow, a 1923 melodrama about twin sisters, one good and one evil. For decades, it was thought lost until 3 of the 6 reels were rediscovered in the New Zealand Film Archive in 2011. Hitchcock, then 24, worked as the screenwriter, assistant director, and art director on the film, which was officially directed by Graham Cutts. This early experience gave him invaluable training and helped shape the cinematic style he would become famous for. Did he serve as his own cameo in almost all his films? Alfred Hitchcock's filmography stretches across more than 50 films over 6 decades, and spotting him in a cameo became almost a signature feature of his work. It's as common as the stories of obsession, suspense, and dark psychological twists that define his movies. More than half of his films include a brief appearance by the director himself, and once he moved to Hollywood in the 1940s, these cameos became more frequent and noticeable. By the mid-1950s, around the time of his TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents, his on-screen appearances carried a knowing, playful quality that fans eagerly looked out for, often pointing to him as soon as he appeared. Hitchcock's cameos rarely served a narrative purpose, but they often included recurring motifs. He was frequently seen as an ordinary pedestrian walking through a scene, whether in Rope, The Trouble with Harry, Vertigo, or The Birds. Public transportation often featured in these appearances too, with Hitchcock boarding a train in Strangers on a Train, sitting on a bus in To Catch a Thief, or missing a bus in North by Northwest. On occasion, he carried objects like musical instruments, as seen in Spellbound and The Paradigm Case. Over time, he became conscious of placing these appearances within the first few minutes of the film, keeping the audience focused on the story while still leaving a little signature behind. His first cameo happened somewhat by chance. On the set of his British film The Lodger, a story of the London fog, Hitchcock was originally not meant to show up on screen at all. A small role for a telephone operator was unfilled when the actor didn't show up, so Hitchcock stepped in instead of him. Unlike his later, more playful cameos, this appearance was subtle, showing him hunched over at a desk with his back to the camera. It was purely functional, but it planted the idea that would grow into a recurring feature in his films. In the 1950s and 60s, as his fame kept increasing, Hitchcock's cameos started to become more recognizable. He sometimes looked directly at the camera or added a small gesture that only attentive viewers would notice. By the time of his final film, Family Plot, he had become so famous that his presence alone, sometimes just a silhouette, was enough for audiences to spot him. Was Hitchcock obsessed with secrecy around Psycho? Even before filming began, Hitchcock understood that keeping the story a secret was crucial to the movie's impact. He went so far as to buy up as many copies of the novel as he could to make sure the shocking twists stayed hidden. He knew he was creating something audiences had not experienced before, and he was right. The infamous shower scene, which suddenly kills off Marion Crane, the film's supposed main character played by Janet Leigh, stunned viewers. Shot from more than 77 different angles on a specially built set, the scene is a masterclass in both filmmaking and suspense, made even more unforgettable with Bernard Herrmann's score. As the release approached, Hitchcock made sure the twists stayed under wraps. He personally handled the marketing, stopping the usual pre-release interviews with the cast. Critics would not get to see the film early either. Everyone had to experience it for the first time in theaters. He also introduced strict rules for theater owners, including a no-late admissions policy, and asked audiences not to reveal what they had seen to anyone who had not watched the film yet. Although the film did not have a formal warning system at the time, Hitchcock essentially created the world's first spoiler alert. The strategy worked, and Psycho became one of the most famous and influential films ever made. Did he refuse to meet Steven Spielberg? It's surprising to think that two of the most famous names in film history, Alfred Hitchcock and Steven Spielberg, never actually met. In 1975, Spielberg was quickly rising to Hollywood stardom thanks to the massive success of Jaws, while Hitchcock was finishing up his decades-long career with his final film, Family Plot. Given his admiration for Hitchcock, it makes sense that Spielberg would want to meet the master of suspense, but Hitchcock was not interested, and his reasons were unusual, to say the least. Bruce Dern, who worked closely with Hitchcock on Family Plot, had a front-row view of the director's habits and personality. During production, he noticed a young Spielberg hanging around the set. Dern explained who Spielberg was and that he just wanted a few minutes to learn from his idol. Even with assurance that Spielberg would be no trouble, Hitchcock refused. For some reason, the very idea of meeting Spielberg made him uncomfortable. He referred to Spielberg dismissively as the boy that made the Fish movie, and said that he felt uneasy about the whole situation. Spielberg's interest in Hitchcock didn't start with Family Plot. About 10 years earlier, he had sneaked onto the set of Hitchcock's 1966 espionage thriller, Torn Kurt. He managed to watch briefly from the back of a theater crowded with extras before being told to leave. Despite the brief glimpse, he never got the chance to interact with the director. Did he make documentaries about Nazi concentration camps? During World War II, Hitchcock, like many Hollywood directors, contributed to the Allied effort by making propaganda films. He produced 2 short films for the British Ministry of Information that focused on French resistance fighters. In the summer of 1945, he also worked on assembling footage from liberated concentration camps for a documentary called Memory of the Camps. He collaborated with writers who actually witnessed the horrors firsthand and gave guidance to the cameramen on how to capture the shocking realities of the camps. The documentary was originally meant for a German audience, but the British government decided it could hurt the already fragile morale of the nation, so it was shelved. Memory of the Camps did not reach the public until the 1980s, when it began showing at film festivals and on television. More recently, the HBO documentary Night Will Fall explored the story behind what has been called Hitchcock's Lost Holocaust film. It talks about how camera crews followed Allied forces as they entered Nazi death camps and captured the devastation. For a long time, no one really knew how much Hitchcock had to do with the project. When the film was finally found in a vault at London's Imperial War Museum, one of its 6 reels was missing, and the typed script had no date or signature. Still, what remained were shocking, raw images of the concentration camps, showing gas chambers, heaps of bodies, burning crematoria, and the hollow faces of starving survivors. Hitchcock helped edit parts of the film and even worked on it without asking for payment. Years later, in 1985, 5 of the 6 reels were recovered. The missing parts were filled in with the script, and actor Trevor Howard was brought in to narrate. The film was shown just as it was originally meant to be, untouched and brutally honest. When it finally aired, critics called it one of the most powerful and important historical records ever made. Did Hitchcock's wife secretly shape his masterpiece films? Alma Reville and Hitchcock had worked on some of the same films at Islington, but it wasn't until 1923 that they started collaborating closely. At that point, famous players had stepped away from production in Brit, and independent producer Michael Balkan was running the studio. Reville was first brought on as an editor, but she quickly began helping Hitchcock with scripts for new projects, often without credit. When Hitchcock got the chance to direct, Reville stepped in as his assistant director, becoming one of Britain's first women in that role. During the filming of his debut film, The Pleasure Garden, in 1927, Hitchcock relied heavily on her, constantly checking in to make sure things were going as planned. Reville also handled much of the practical and financial work on location in Europe and later supervised the film's editing. By the time The Pleasure Garden was released, Reville had already made a name for herself. People saw her as smart and ahead of her time. In 1925, a fan magazine even called her one of the rising talents in British cinema. They wrote of how she might one day move into directing, though she didn't end up doing that. After the birth of their only child, Patricia, in 1928, Reville shifted her focus towards screenwriting, a role that offered more flexibility and could better accommodate family life. She later admitted that she felt she didn't have the temperament or physical presence for directing, a view Hitchcock seemed to support, noting that some of the more demanding aspects of production were difficult for her to manage. Despite moving behind the scenes, Reville remained Hitchcock's closest collaborator and most trusted advisor throughout his career. He often looked to her for approval after each take in his early films, and even as his fame grew, she continued to advise on scripts, casting, and editing well into the 1960s. One of her most notable contributions was encouraging Hitchcock to use Bernard Herrmann's iconic string score for the shower scene in Psycho, a decision that would become central to one of cinema's most famous moments. Did Hitchcock keep control over some of his films by owning them? Even though Hitchcock had sold the rights to Psycho to Universal Pictures, who later turned it into a massive franchise, he was far more protective of some of his other films. Back in 1953, he had signed a 5-picture deal with Paramount Pictures that worked heavily in his favor. The deal stated that 8 years after their original release, the rights to those films would return to Hitchcock himself. At the time, Paramount did not think much of it. They assumed old films would not make much money after being out of theaters for so long, especially since home video and reruns were not really a thing yet. When the time came, Hitchcock took full advantage. The films that reverted to him were Vertigo, Rear Window, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Rope, and The Trouble with Harry. Instead of re-releasing them like most studios would, Hitchcock made the unusual decision to pull them completely from circulation starting in 1961. That meant anyone who wanted to screen those movies, whether film festivals, universities, or TV networks, had to get his personal permission, and Hitchcock was known for turning down most requests. His choice confused many people. By doing this, he was essentially cutting off a steady source of income, since many older films at the time continued to earn big profits through re-releases. But Hitchcock seemed to have a long-term plan. By making these films unavailable for nearly 2 decades, he turned them into something rare and mysterious, almost like buried treasure. So when they were finally made available again after his death in 1980, audiences rushed to see what they had missed. The decision ended up working in his favor. Rear Window, for example, became one of the most studied and influential thrillers of all time. Its idea of a confined, voyeuristic character solving a mystery from a distance inspired countless other films, from Body Double to Fright Night. And Vertigo, once seen as strange and divisive, found new life through critical reappraisal. What was once misunderstood became celebrated, with Vertigo now ranked among the greatest films ever made. Did he once cast Salvador Dali in his films? In 1945, Salvador Dali got a strange request from his movie agent. Someone wanted him to design a nightmare. The person behind that request was none other than Alfred Hitchcock, who was working on a dream sequence for his psychological thriller Spellbound. By then, Dali had already distanced himself from the surrealist movement, but his bizarre and dreamlike art had made him a big name in America. Hitchcock didn't bring Dali in just because he was famous. He liked the sharpness and clarity of Dali's art. He didn't want the usual hazy, soft-focused dream scenes that Hollywood was known for. Instead, he wanted something striking and vivid, something that looked even more real than the rest of the film. Dali's surreal style was the perfect match for that vision. Dali's dream dream sequence appears at a key point in the movie. It begins as Gregory Peck's character describes his dream to Ingmar Bergman. The scene shifts from his words to a world straight out of Dali's imagination. Floating eyes that turn into torn curtains. A man slicing them apart with huge scissors. Faceless figures, blank playing cards, and strange rocks that seem to have faces. Was blackmail the first British talkie? In 1929, Hollywood was moving fast. Sound films started replacing the silent movies that had dominated the industry for decades. In Britain, the film scene was struggling to compete with Hollywood's constant output. During all this change, a young Alfred Hitchcock saw an opportunity rather than a challenge. For him, sound was not a threat to storytelling, it was a new tool to enhance it, and he would use it to push British cinema forward. At 30, Hitchcock had already made a name for himself with The Lodger. By 1929, he was finishing his 10th silent feature, Blackmail, adapted from a popular stage play by Charles Bennett. British International Pictures producer John Maxwell offered him access to some basic RCA photophone sound equipment from America. Intrigued, Hitchcock began experimenting, knowing that integrating sound into film would be complicated. Theater wiring was slow and expensive, so movies during this period were often a mix of silence, part talkies, and full talking pictures. For British filmmakers, competing with Hollywood was already tough, and sound added another layer of difficulty. Hitchcock did not see these problems as setbacks. He saw them as chances to try something new. Because early sound equipment was clunky and noisy, cameras had to be wrapped to silence them, lights were dimmed, and actors had to adjust to all kinds of restrictions. In one case, Hitchcock even locked cameras inside soundproof rooms, which got so hot that working inside them was almost unbearable. When the technology for dubbing didn't exist yet, he had to improvise. During the filming of Blackmail, the lead actress, Annie Andra, had a strong accent that did not fit the story. Instead of replacing her, Hitchcock came up with a clever solution. Another actress read her lines off camera while Andra silently mouthed them on screen. But Hitchcock didn't just want sound to be a background feature. He used it to tell the story in new ways. He experimented with how sound could reveal what a character was feeling or create tension. One of the most memorable examples is the scene where a nosy neighbor talks about a murder while Alice, the main character, sits lost in her own thoughts. As the neighbor keeps talking, the sound fades until only the word knife stands out, until Alice, overwhelmed, drops the knife from her hand. Did he once handcuff his actors to help build chemistry? Hitchcock's complicated relationship with his actresses has been talked about in almost every book ever written about it. He had a strange mix of control and cruelty when it came to working with women, both on and off camera. He wanted everything to look and feel exactly the way he imagined it, even if that meant putting his actresses through uncomfortable or humiliating situations. One example comes from the making of The 39 Steps. Hitchcock handcuffed the two main actors, Robert Donat and Madeleine Carroll, together for a scene and then pretended that the key was missing. When Carroll needed a break, he refused to let them out of the cuffs. The two were stuck together for quite some time before Hitchcock suddenly found the key in his coat pocket. He later claimed it was all part of helping them build better on-screen chemistry. Before filming Vertigo, Hitchcock invited actress Kim Novak to dinner. Instead of making her feel welcome, he spent the evening talking about fine art and expensive wine. These were topics that he knew might make her uncomfortable because of her modest background. It was a subtle but intentional way of asserting power and control, just like he did with his characters on screen. For Hitchcock, these actions were part of how he drew out performances that matched his vision. But looking back, it's clear that his methods often came at the expense of the people he worked with. Did Hitchcock create the bird effects in The Birds using electronics? The original plan for The Birds was pretty ambitious. Hitchcock wanted to use mechanical birds with motorized wings for all the attack scenes, and the studio spent more than $200,000 building them, which would be over $2 million today. But when they tested the fake birds on camera, they looked awful. The movement was stiff and unnatural, and no amount of clever editing could fix it. So the plan was scrapped. That's when animal trainer Ray Berwick stepped in to catch, thousands of real birds, gulls, crows, ravens, sparrows, and finches to use during filming. But this was far from easy. Crows and ravens are incredibly smart, and once they realized humans were trying to catch them, they would warn the rest of the flock. Berwick's team could barely catch more than one or two before the rest took off. The studio even tried offering a $10 reward per bird for trappers around the country, but that didn't help either. Eventually, Berwick found a huge rookery in Arizona with tens of thousands of birds. He and his crew dressed head to toe in black, painted their faces to blend in, and crept in at night to catch the sleeping birds with nets. By the end, they had gathered over 25,000 live birds for the film. But that did not mean that all their troubles were over. Once they were on set, these wild birds were not exactly easy to control. Berwick later said that the crew learned quickly to be afraid of them, especially the seagulls. In one day alone, more than a dozen crew members ended up in the hospital with bites and scratches. The gulls often went straight for people's eyes. Even Berwick was not spared, getting pecked near the eye several times, and Tippi Hedren was badly cut above her eye during one scene. The chaos did not stop there. Actor Rod Taylor once said that the gulls were fed wheat mixed with whiskey to keep them calm, something that definitely would not work on a movie set today. The crew admitted to using tranquilizers and even tying birds in place for some shots, which caused them to topple over or hang awkwardly from the roof until someone climbed up to fix them. To make things worse, many of the wild birds brought lice with them, which spread quickly among the cast and crew, and some of the birds managed to escape, both from the outdoor sets and inside the studio. According to associate editor Bud Hoffman, a whole group of crows ended up nesting in a tree near Hitchcock's office on the Universal lot. They refused to leave and spent their days constantly dropping on his car. After countless failed attempts to scare them off, the maintenance team finally had to cut the tree's branches off just to get the crows to move on. Did you know Hitchcock helped write the Encyclopedia Britannica? Believe it or not, Alfred Hitchcock actually helped write part of the Encyclopedia Britannica. In the 14th edition, he personally worked on a section called Motion Pictures Film Production, where he shared his own thoughts and experiences about filmmaking. He talked about camera movement, pointing out that just because a camera can move doesn't mean it should. Hitchcock felt that some directors used camera motion just to show off, like tracking a taxi as it pulls up to a building, even when it added nothing to the story. To him, unnecessary movement could distract from the real focus, the emotion and meaning of the scene. Marvelous verdict. Well, with that, guys, we've come to the end of yet another fun video. Now, I want to hear more from you. Were you guys aware of these things before? Are there any more surprising facts about the master of suspense that we've left out here? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching this, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Thanks for watching. Till next time.